Welcome to the History Den YouTube channel. This is the 11th video in the Ancient Greek series. We come now to the events that lead up to the Battle of Salamis, which is the decisive turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. But before we get to Salamis, we should talk about what's just happened at Thermopylae and Artemisium. So the Persians have busted through the defenses at Thermopylae and Artemisium in the north, and therefore the road was now open to all of central and southern Greece for the Persians. And so the Persians went on a rampage. They proceeded to burn and sack several Boeotian cities which had not surrendered. The city of Plataea was the most notable to be destroyed. After that, the Persian army and fleet began moving in tandem toward the city of Athens. Now, a huge debate raged on in Athens about what to do. Themistocles provided his revised strategy to the assembly. But the problem with this is it went against the Greek sense of honor. And that is, if your lands were invaded by an enemy, you marched out and fought that invader to the last man to prevent them from destroying your homes and farms. But only after much prodding from Themistocles, the Athenians finally, and I might point out wisely, agreed with Themistocles that to fight the entire Persian army on land would be complete suicide. So the decision was made to retreat to the island of Salamis. But it would be an evacuation under duress, as the Persians were only now a day's march from the gates of Athens itself. The retreating Greek allied fleet from Artemisium was able to assist with the evacuation to Salamis. So most of Athens was now left unoccupied. One thing to note here is Themistocles apparently left inscriptions addressed directly to the Ionian Greek crews in the Persian fleet. And he asked them to defect, to come over to the Greek side and to defend Greece against the Persian onslaught. For the Athenians left in Attica, few expected little mercy from the invading Persians. And their worst fears were confirmed when Xerxes had the entire area set ablaze. Crops and farms were burned, resulting in the wholesale destruction of the entire countryside. In Athens itself, temples and buildings were razed and looted. Even worse, the statue of the gods were destroyed. Xerxes thus captured his main objective of the entire Greco-Persian War, Athens. And you might even say his revenge was complete. After all, it was Athens who had assisted the Ionians in their rebellion against the Persians in Asia Minor. But the Persians weren't interested in just taking Athens alone. They now set their goals on all of Greece and turning Greece into one gigantic satrapy, a satrapy that would be part of the Persian Empire. Now, even though the Athenians had opted for Salamis, their Greek allies were not so sure. Another debate raged on at several war councils as to where the allies should confront the mighty Persian navy. Now, anytime there was a disagreement, the Greeks, of course, always had to have a war council. And it was at this war council that Eurybiades and the Peloponnesian bloc argued the Isthmus line was the more logical choice. They wanted to demolish the single road that led through the isthmus and build a wall across it. Now, the Greek allied fleet was currently parked in the Straits of Salamis. The Peloponnesian bloc wanted to move the navy from Salamis to the coast off of the isthmus and set up a blockade there. However, Themistocles argued to allow the Persian navy free access to the Greek seas would expose all of mainland Greece, including Sparta. He also argued that the isthmus would give all the advantages to the Persian navy, as the main battle would be fought out in the open sea, where Persian numbers alone could be decisive. Keeping the navy at Salamis would keep the fight in the narrow straits where the Greeks could even the odds. And if a victory could be secured at Salamis, there would be no need to defend the isthmus, as the Persians would likely have to retreat out of Greece. Themistocles won the day again, and the allies settled on keeping the navy off the coast of Salamis. And we have to imagine Themistocles must have been a very persuasive man, because the Spartans' modus operandi, of course, was to fight on land. So defending the isthmus line was the more natural strategy for them. But Themistocles also undoubtedly had the most sway, since 3/4 of the fleet was supplied by Athens and her allies. Interestingly, these rifts between the allies would be used by Themistocles later on to deceive Xerxes. So we should put this whole thing in context. We have to remember the absolute importance of the coming battle at Salamis. This really was the Greeks' last shot, because a loss here and the Persian navy would have dominated all the seas around Greece and essentially would have been free to do whatever they wanted. In addition, if the Greek navy lost at Salamis, defending the isthmus at Corinth would have been a moot point, because it would have been practically impossible without the Greek navy protecting the coastline. Now, it took the Persians about 2 or 3 weeks to capture Athens. During this time, the Persians were refitting their battered fleet and resupplying their forces on land. After capturing Athens, Xerxes held a war council with his top generals. Now, some of his commanders tried to convince him to wait for the allies to surrender, believing that the battle in the Straits of Salamis was an unnecessary risk. Xerxes and his leading general, Mardonius, rejected these arguments and pressed for an attack. Now, at this critical juncture, Xerxes could have opted to bypass Salamis altogether and head for the Isthmus of Corinth. But that would expose his fleet to dangerous flanking attacks and potentially cut off his land forces from their all-important seaborne supplies. Finally, the decision was made to neutralize the Greek fleet at Salamis. The Persian navy arrived outside the Straits of Salamis and set up camp there. They continued to shadow the Greek navy for weeks just outside the straits, but refused to enter. The Greeks were unwilling to give battle outside the straits, so a sort of stalemate occurred. It seems at some point just before the battle, new intel was provided to Xerxes that exposed the rifts in the Allied command. In any event, this alleged rift was on Xerxes' mind just before the battle. In the meantime, he ordered his fleet to go out on patrol off the coast of Salamis, blocking the southern exit. Okay, so Themistocles faced several big problems staying put at Salamis. First, his supplies were dwindling on the island, and if the Persians blockaded the seas, they could take Salamis without a fight, as some of Xerxes' commanders had hoped to do. Themistocles also had to keep his constantly wavering Greek allies from retreating back to the isthmus, because they still wouldn't let go of this strategy, and they were constantly pressing Themistocles to allow them to set up a defense at the isthmus. In fact, the night before the big battle, the Peloponnesian allies almost did just that. So the key point here is time is of the essence, and the only way this plan would work is if Themistocles could somehow induce the Persians to enter the narrow straits. So while the Persians were balking at entering the straits, it seems Themistocles was doing everything to get them in there and to force the decisive battle he so desired. At this critical juncture, it seems Themistocles decided to trick the Persians by an elaborate ruse. He sent word out that the Allied navy was in complete disarray and were planning to retreat under the cover of darkness. Therefore, a lightning strike by the Persian navy could destroy or force many of the Greek ships to surrender. Themistocles even sent word to Xerxes, promising his own cooperation and assistance to the Persians. For Xerxes, this had the potential of a war-winning battle, and he was inclined to believe the reports. Xerxes took the bait and ordered his fleet into the Narrows. Before the battle, he sent a lone Egyptian squadron westward to block the Megarian Channel and any supposed Greek retreat. So before we get to the actual Battle of Salamis, let's talk about the quantity and quality of the ships. Some of the ships provided by Athens and her allies were barely serviceable retrofits. The bulkier Greek ships were not nearly as fast as the lighter Persian vessels, and could easily be outmaneuvered on the open seas. Though Athens by far contributed the most ships, the Peloponnesian states did provide about 100 ships. Numbers and quality were not the only problem for the Greek fleet. The Persian sailors were far more experienced and numerous than Greek crews. The Persians also had more archers and marines aboard their ships than the Greeks. So Themistocles, who was in charge of the entire fleet, would have to take into account the disadvantage of his crews, which numbered around 65,000 total sailors. Now, the number of Persian ships is believed to be around 650, and they outnumbered the Greek ships at least 2 to 1, which modern estimates put at around 371 vessels. So as you can see, the Greeks were clearly outnumbered. So as the Persian fleet is entering the straits, Xerxes watched the battle from the top of a mountain where he could observe the movements of both fleets. For the main assault, the Persians formed into 3 ranks. The Phoenicians were on the right, the allied Persians were in the center, and the Ionian Greeks were on the left. Every Ionian vessel, interestingly enough, had a force of Persians on board to keep the Greek sailors loyal to Persia. The entire Persian navy was spread about in a mile-wide front. The Greeks split into three main squadrons. The Athenians were on the left, the Allies were in the center, and the Spartan squadrons took up the position of honor on the right, since Eurybiades was the commanding admiral of the battle fleet. The Greek Navy's line was also about a mile long across the strait. They would face in a northeasterly direction towards the Persian squadrons. The Greeks apparently kicked off the battle by feigning a retreat, adding to the deception that the Allies were in disarray. The Persian squadron surged forward, chasing the Greeks. The Greeks simply turned around and deployed their fleet and faced off against the Persians in the Narrows. The Athenian squadrons went head-to-head with the Phoenicians, and both the Athenians and the Phoenicians were the cream of the crop in their respective navies. The victor of this engagement would likely decide the entire battle. Now, disaster struck for the Phoenicians as their commander was killed. With no competent deputy able to take over, the Phoenicians retreated from the fight with the Athenians in hot pursuit. It only got worse for the Persian fleet as the general engagement began. As Themistocles suspected, the Persian navy became bogged down in the narrow body of water and were unable to maneuver. To make matters worse, a sharp southern breeze created choppy waves, making it even harder for the lighter Persian vessels to stay afloat. With the Narrows crowded with clanging and tilting Persian ships, the Greeks tore into the enemy with all of their ships. The lumbering Persian ships were easy targets for the ramming Greek vessels. In short order, the Persians found themselves surrounded from all sides, with no line of retreat. Many Persian ships were simply boarded and destroyed by Greek hoplites. The hoplites were able to go from ship to ship, making quick work of the much lighter-armed Persian sailors. The Greeks eventually smashed through the Persian center, dividing the Persian navy into two. At this point, the Persian ships en masse began to break ranks, and the right and center flanks began to flee back towards Phalerum. Interestingly enough, only the Ionian squadrons held the line. At this point, the Athenians broke off their pursuit of the Phoenicians and ripped into the Ionian rear. Faced with the impossible task of taking on the entire Greek fleet, the Ionians at last gave up and also fled the battle. So the Greek victory was complete and Greece was saved from the Persians. And much of the credit is deservedly attributed to the careful planning and genius of Themistocles. The battle was a titanic loss for the Persian navy. They lost around 300 ships, almost half of their fleet, compared to only 40 for the Greeks. The reinvigorated Greeks now were able to move their navy out of the straits. With the open seas at least contested, if not tilted in the Greeks' favor, Xerxes had no other choice but to retreat back to Asia Minor. His fleet risked complete destruction if he remained in Greece, and he could not keep his field army in Attica rationed properly. He also, according to Herodotus, was concerned the Greeks might cut him off at the Hellespont. There was little choice but to evacuate with what was left of his navy and secure his most important line of communications at the Hellespont. Now, the Greeks initially did not realize how significant their victory was at Salamis. They expected another naval attack at Salamis. Once they realized how complete their naval victory had been, a war council was held between the Greek allies as to what to do. One of the main questions was, should they pursue Xerxes and destroy the bridges at the Hellespont? There was still a real worry that the Persians would simply turn around and fight another all-out land engagement. After all, the Persian field army still remained a huge threat. Eventually, the Greeks decided they would allow Xerxes to retreat out of Greece unhindered. Athens was recaptured comparatively easily in 479 BC, since Xerxes had abandoned Attica for Thessaly. The Battle of Salamis was a major turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. It was a tremendous blow to Persian morale, and at the same time a huge boost to the Greeks. This was the Greeks' midway of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persians no longer maintained the naval initiative, and the Greeks had crucial time to organize their land forces. The Battle of Salamis remains to this day one of the greatest naval battles in military history. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video where we will discuss the Battle of Plataea.